Warning: this video contains scary content that may be disturbing to some viewers. An ominous legend spread through the small, gloomy town of Shadow Valley, terrifying its inhabitants. It was said that a mysterious figure was able to enter people's dreams and disturb them to the core until they were driven mad. At first, the tales were thought to be simple stories, but it soon became clear that this was not the case. The once bustling streets, filled with beaming people, now resembled a ghost town. The inhabitants looked ominously disturbed. There was the purest expression of horror and hopelessness in their eyes. It was as if their souls had left their bodies. Nobody talked to each other anymore. People were insanely afraid of each other. The mistrust among the people grew dramatically. An elderly man, who was known and beloved by everyone, started to behave differently. His once calm and friendly demeanor changed from one day to the next. He became extremely terrified and paranoid. He told that a demon has entered his life and was trying to kill him. It didn't take long until his sanity was gone. Later, when the old man was killed in a car accident after the horror figure kept him awake for nights with unimaginable nightmares and poisoned his mind with hallucinations, everyone realized that these were no fairy tales. He wasn't the only one who experienced this mental torture. As time went on, more and more people felt this evil presence. And all the stories had one thing in common. Each of the victims told of this unbelievably horrible horror figure that haunted people in their dreams. It was pure evil and was appearing more and more rapidly, like an evil virus that infected the entire city and gradually sucked the life out of it. It was as if dark forces had cursed the city. A particularly gruesome case involved a young woman called Laura. She was a pretty but shy woman who lived her life in relative solitude. In her childhood, she lost her parents in a terrible car accident. Only she survived. It was inexplicable that she survived almost unscathed. Since this drastic experience, she spent most of her youth in a youth home and with foster families. It was a time when bad things happened to her. Domestic violence and neglect were the order of the day in a foster family. Laura has struggled with severe depression ever since and has almost completely isolated herself. One night, as she went to sleep, her life was suddenly changed forever. In her dreams, she suddenly found herself on a dark street. Only the white lantern light provided some brightness. It was absolutely dark and cold. There was a thick fog in the area. There was absolute silence. Only the soft blowing of the wind and the rustling of the trees could be heard. Laura walked slowly along the road. There was nothing and no one to be seen for miles around. Suddenly, loud screams sounded from a distance. This was followed by a loud bang that made Laura's blood run cold. They weren't strange voices. They were very familiar to her. All at once, Laura realized what it was. She couldn't believe it. She had to see it for herself. Was her mind playing tricks on her? The whole situation seemed too real. Her eyes filled with tears. Her heart pounded with all its might. She ran as fast as she could to the source of the noise. And indeed, her assumption turned out to be true. It was the same car accident she had witnessed all those years before. Laura saw the smashed car and sprinted towards it. Was it different this time? Did her parents survive? She asked herself these questions as she ran. Her lungs were burning, but hope drove her forward. After all those years of trauma, pain, and hopelessness, she only wanted one thing: to see her parents one more time. What she would give to be hugged by them once again and to be told that everything would be all right. Since the death of her parents, Laura has felt no love and no joy. Since then, her life has been marked by pure sadness. She often wished that she hadn't survived the accident either, and then she saw something that left her stunned. Her parents got out of the wrecked car. They were both unharmed. Laura screamed as loud as she could for her parents. She screamed so loudly that she was almost hoarse. Her mother slowly turned around and, for the first time in years, Laura looked her in the eye. Her mother's facial expression didn't change at all. She stood completely still without any movement. She looked at her daughter with a blank expression, a look that made Laura stop short. A cold shiver ran through her. Had her mother forgotten what she looked like? No, that couldn't be, Laura thought to herself. But although it was her own mother, her look was so strange that Laura felt an incredible emotional pain. She took hold of herself and continued running towards her parents. "Mom, I'm so glad to see you again," Laura said as she tried to hug them. But her mother fought her off. "Don't touch me!" she screamed. "You killed us! You distracted us while we were driving, which caused the accident. You couldn't keep your mouth shut, you bitch. I wish you'd never been born. You're a failure, a petty nobody. We're dead, Laura, we're dead. And only because of you. Our blood is on your hands. Tell me, how can you look in the mirror? You murderer!" she screamed. Laura froze. She couldn't say anything. Her eyes were wide open. Her blood froze in her veins. I was a little child. I didn't know what I was doing. Please forgive me. Please, Mom, don't say that. Daddy, please, Laura pleaded. She didn't know what to say. The pain was too deep. She cried bitterly. Her father, who hadn't said anything yet, smiled a disturbing grin. He began to laugh hysterically. "You're a disgrace. But we should still be grateful that you killed us. At least we don't have to put up with you anymore," he said. Laura could hardly believe it. She didn't know what to say. She begged and pleaded for forgiveness, but it didn't help. Suddenly, her parents' eyes turned pitch black. A demonic grimace appeared on their faces. They stared deep into Laura's eyes and slowly approached her. "Murderer! Murderer! Murderer!" they screamed at the same time. "No, please! Stop it! Please!" Laura screamed. She sank to the floor. She was filled with pure despair. Never before had she felt so lost, defenseless, and guilty. But suddenly her parents disappeared in a black smoke, and out of nowhere, an absolutely unearthly scream rang out that was not of this world. A sinister figure appeared, with long, bony fingers and glowing, empty eyes. Its breath smelled of decay, and it whispered disturbing things in Laura's ear, driving her to the brink of madness. She spoke of sins and guilt, of a dark fate that awaited Laura. Her voice was absolutely ghastly and inhuman. Her hair was long and black. She was pure evil. When Laura finally woke up from this nightmare, she couldn't calm down for days. She thought she could see the figure lurking in the shadows of her room, and the smell of decay didn't seem to leave her nose. The words of her parents and those of the creature lingered in her head. Laura sank into a deep hole of loneliness. She blamed herself for the death of her parents. She now saw herself as a cold-blooded murderer. The more she thought about the words, the more she began to believe them. Not a day or night went by when Laura could rest. The creature spoke to her and haunted her dreams. It got worse from time to time. The young woman could not rest, and many sleepless nights passed. In everyday life, the voice of the monster spoke to Laura in her thoughts. Like many other people, Laura began to talk to the voice and begged the creature to leave her alone. But it only got worse. The lonely woman was driven mad. Finally, the voice made her a diabolical offer. The voice urged Laura to kill innocent people. In return, the demon would leave her in peace. Laura was desperate. She didn't know what to do. No matter what Laura did, the creature plagued her. It projected the images of her dead parents almost everywhere Laura looked. The demonic monster manipulated her victim's perception and made all people look like menacing monsters. It was pure torture. The sleepless nights, the hallucinations, and the panic-stricken fear of people drove Laura mad. Out of mistrust of the others, Laura got herself a gun and took it with her everywhere. Everyone was a potential enemy. She didn't know who was a slave to the demon and what the helpless souls were capable of. It was only a matter of time before the creature would win. And indeed, Laura was overcome with weakness. One day, when she went to the psychologist for help, the voice forced Laura to take the man's life. Laura tried to ignore it as best she could, but it was so loud that she could no longer hear the psychologist's words. He tried to calm her down, but to no avail. The desperate woman screamed and covered her ears, but it didn't help. And out of sheer hopelessness and fear, Laura obeyed the creature. A loud shot rang out from the therapy room, and then there was absolute silence. The voice fell silent. The psychologist rushed out of the room in a panic and called an ambulance, but it was in vain. Laura was not the only victim of the creature. The inhabitants of Shadow Valley began to fear going to sleep, as no one knew who would be haunted by the creature next. The darkness and madness it brought to their dreams eventually drove those affected mad. No one could feel safe from this horrific figure that lurked in the world of dreams and disturbed its victims to the core. Shadow Valley became a city of terror, where the inhabitants, feared in their beds, closed their eyes to the darkness and hoped for the day when the figure would finally be defeated. But the terrible dreams and the dark presence of the figure did not stop. The inhabitants were haunted by nightmares that racked their souls until their heads were filled with the darkest thoughts. Slowly, the city lost its former cheerfulness, and the inhabitants became shadows of themselves. The streets were empty, the windows boarded up, and people no longer dared to venture out into the darkness of the night. Shadow Valley sank deeper and deeper into darkness, and the figure in the nightmares laughed quietly as it drove the townspeople mad with no hope of an end. The fear amongst the people became a shadowy reality that took over their lives. They no longer dared to sleep for fear of the terrible nightmares. Eventually, they fell into an endless state of sleeplessness, and their faces faded into mask-like expressions of horror. The once vibrant town became a haunted place, its inhabitants lost in a web of darkness and despair. The figure in the dream seemed to be everywhere, a demon that never left. And the inhabitants of Shadow Valley had no hope, for their souls had long been trapped in a nightmare that knew no end. The dark legend of the town became a terrible reality, and it was doomed to remain in eternal darkness and fear.